We just really wanted to touch on fire risk, obviously because it's been such a topical issue over the last couple of months, or over the last year, obviously since Grenfell. When I worked on a legal helpline after Grenfell Towers had just happened, we had about 80 to 90 clients actually phone up from a letting agency perspective, just to clarify the legal position. They were getting lots of phone calls from their landlord clients asking what is the legal position regarding fire safety. So what we'll do this afternoon, in the next 15-20 minutes or so, we'll hopefully just give a very brief overview of the position and hopefully give you a sort of understanding about what you need to do as a landlord or letting agent to protect yourself. As we know, in this very litigious age, making sure that you're compliant and showing to the best of your ability compliance is an important part of what you do as a letting agent and a landlord. So we'll quickly run through some bits in terms of legislation, etc. So hopefully the first thing I wanted to bring up, and hopefully my slides will move, or maybe not, which may be the case. Hopefully you all can see this video. This is if it shows, this is a video just really regarding a CCTV camera which is showing a shed which obviously contained petrol and also had faulty electrics in terms of the light, and it shows you what potentially could happen in respect of fire. And this was the CCTV was being used for security purposes, but obviously just shows you that even a small electrical fault caused quite considerable damage to that particular shed, and as you can see, caused a significant fire to happen. So in terms of what we do as letting agents and property managers, it's just really important that we understand that we've assessed the risk of a particular property, and that could be a minor or major risk, and really it's just about understanding what our obligations are as a letting agent, and just being able to minimize that risk. What do we do to minimize that risk to a tenant or any of the occupiers? And from our perspective, showing that we tried to the best of our ability to minimize that risk. We can't eliminate risk in its entirety. No one can. But from our position as professionals, we need to show that we have tried, where possible, to minimize that risk to a tenant. And if something does happen, and worst case scenario, someone potentially has died in a fire, in terms of the coroner, they would be saying, what did you do as the landlord or property manager to minimize that risk? And from our perspective, it's all about showing due diligence. And as always, evidence is really important. Written evidence about what we did to minimize that risk is going to show we've tried to comply where necessary. So from our perspective, especially for the letting agents out there, it's about showing a duty of care to our landlords and our tenants, and the tenants, shall I say, and it can potentially provide us with an additional income stream in making sure, obviously, we protect the landlord and tenant. So from today's position, it's really about understanding the obligation to conduct a risk assessment. It will be required in certain situations, and will be in other such situations, in the majority of the situations, deemed as good practice. So again, very similar to electrical safety, there is no obligation to have a electrical condition report for the majority of the properties that we manage, but it is good practice to be seen to be doing so. So very similar in fire risk as well. Again, from your perspective, it's about protecting yourselves, one of your most valuable assets, and equally as important, protecting the tenants from, hopefully, from injury and worst case scenario, death. And from our position, it's about making sure that when we've done the risk assessment, that we take proactive actions to minimize the risk, and where necessary, that we obviously conduct subsequent reviews. So whenever there's a change in risk, maybe there's a change in tenant, etc., again, that may require us to review the risk assessment, take into account new information that we've come across, etc. So what we'll cover today is the legislation that covers fire safety, the potential different scenarios where the legislation would be relevant, and then potential actions that you could take. And a lot of the actions that we'll talk about today will be very simplistic. I'm sure that you could go around the property that you live in currently and very easily identify potential risk hazards or hazards which could potentially cause a fire. And that is is as simple as a property manager or letting agent needs to do in terms of risk assessing a tenanted property. Obviously, there will be some properties, maybe the more complex HMOs, where it will be beyond the expertise of a landlord or a letting agent to be able to conduct a risk assessment, and that's maybe where you'll need to involve the services of the local fire brigade, who I know will be more than happy to try and provide assistance to you, because obviously part of their job is education, awareness, and those types of scenarios. So again, in the more complex properties that you may manage, then it may be a good idea to, as I said, engage the services of a fire professional. But in the majority of cases, a very simple and proportionate response in terms of risk assessment is all that is required. And you'll see that as we go through in terms of what a risk assessment entails. So the legislation itself, so what legislation covers fire safety? So the first one, which is probably the biggest, is the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and I'll refer to it as Fire Safety Order as we go for this afternoon's training. And the Fire Safety Order really applies to the common areas. So if anyone does block management, the common areas of blocks of flats is where the fire safety order would be a legal requirement. So the flat itself may not require a risk assessment, but the common areas of that block of flats may require it. Then we'll talk about the Housing Act 2004 and HHSRS. For anyone that's come across HHSRS, that's generally quite reactive. So where a tenant has complained about the condition of the property, the local council will visit and they will reactively say, actually, there may be fire risks here. So even though it was present at the very start of the tenancy, HHSRS, as I will refer to it today, is a reactive system, as in a complaint's been made by the tenant or a member of the family, or it might be a social worker. The councils then have a legal obligation to conduct HHSRS, and they may say, actually, there needs to be A, B, and C installed here to minimize the risk to a particular tenant stroke occupier. There's also, under the Housing Act 2004, license conditions. So for example, if you have a mandatory licensable HMO, which is where there's 5 or more occupiers over 3 or more floors, then there may be, or there is a general obligation under the license conditions to have fire safety. So for example, you may have fire doors, you may have an emergency lighting system. It all depends on what the local council say in respect of issuing that license to you, as to what fire safety measures you are required to include within that particular property. Then we have the management of HMOs, which again, there are 2 versions. So if anyone's from Wales today, you have your own version in terms of this piece of regulation, but they're very similar in respect of their obligations upon a landlord or letting agent. But again, if you have a property which is defined as a HMO, so that's 3 or more occupiers who are not all related, so free friends sharing, for example, would be the most simplistic example, then you have a legal obligation to risk assess fire for that particular property. And then the last one, which applies across the board, so for any property that you manage, as you always, I'm sure most of you will be aware, from the 1st of October 2015, there was an obligation to ensure that you had a smoke alarm on each habitable level of the property, and you tested that smoke alarm on the day that the tenancy commenced, and you have evidence of such. So again, that's really important. As I always say, in terms of compliance, etc., 99.9% of the time, you'll probably never ever need the evidence that you've collated. But the 0.0% one time that you do need it, you'll be thankful that you do have it. So again, irrespective of it just being fire safety, whatever you're doing in terms of compliance, it's so important that you have written evidence of what you've done, because you'll never know when you'll need that particular evidence to protect yourself or your landlord or client. So as we said, the fire safety order is non-domestic in the sense that it mainly refers to commercial premises, but from our position, it does apply to the common areas of blocks and flats and maisonettes. So therefore, if I do have a flat in a purpose-built block or in a converted block, then that particular area of the building would be covered by the fire safety order. So again, from my perspective, if I was a landlord or a letting agent, I would be contacting the block managers or freeholders and asking for a copy of the fire risk assessment which they have conducted for the common areas, because they have a legal obligation to do so. So again, that's from my perspective good practice to get that fire risk assessment, so you have that on file, so you can show what fire risk assessments have been done for the common areas. Even though you may not manage the common areas, your tenant, I assume, to get to their particular part of the building will need to access the common areas, and obviously in the event of the fire they will need to get out through the common areas. So again, having that on file shows elements of due diligence, and you can obviously pass it over or a copy over to the tenant or any of the occupiers if necessary. Then we have HHSRS. I'll see if I can get my pen out, but as you see in the top right hand corner, one of the hazards under HHSRS is fire. So when the councils, whoops, let me just go back, sorry. When the councils do fire a risk assessment or an inspection on a particular property, they will conduct a fire hazard inspection, if that's the right way of saying it, which you can see my drawing is not very good. I think I need to go back to school in terms of my art skills, but that's an attempt at highlighting the fire hazard, which is something which a council will do as part of their HHSRS inspection. So as I said, the councils will come along and they say, actually, we've done an inspection across all the hazards under HHSRS, and we've decided you need to do A, B, and C in respect of fire safety. So that may be, for example, putting a heat detector in, which is quite a common requirement. It may be that they request that you put a fire blanket in, which again is in the kitchen, that is, which is again a very common requirement. Sometimes they ask you to interlink the smoke alarms. So there are a number of things which a local council can ask you to do or legally request you to do after they've done an inspection. But again, from our position today, hopefully by going through this particular type of training, you can actually be quite proactive and get these things into the property before even the local council visit, showing elements, as I said, of due diligence and being able to evidence that you've tried to protect the tenants and the occupiers to the best of your ability. So that's under HHSRS. There's the fire risk hazard. Just try and get rid of undo. So hopefully that's got rid of that. Get rid of that. Hopefully that works. The next one in terms of legislation is the management of HMOs. So if you have a property which is defined as a HMO, and many landlords and letting agents will have a property which they don't actually understand in law is actually a HMO. So from that perspective, we need to understand that it's any property where there are 3 or more occupiers who are not all related. And the very simplistic example I use is free friends sharing. That is defined as a HMO. It may not be a mandatory licensable HMO, but it would still fall under the definition of a HMO. So therefore, you have an obligation under this piece of legislation to make sure that you've conducted a risk assessment, and you've followed what's ultimately on the slide, in the sense that you've looked at the fire escapes. Are the fire escapes in good order? Are they easily accessible? Are they not being blocked by rubbish or that type of scenario? Is it easy to get out of? So, for example, in a lot of mandatory licensable HMOs, in terms of the fire exit points, they would have the thumb turn locks. So there isn't actually a key required to get out of the property, because obviously in the event of the fire, the last thing that you would want to be looking for is a set of keys trying to open the rear or the front exit. So in a lot of mandatory licensable HMOs, they have the thumb turn locks, or they require the thumb turn locks on the inside of the door, so an occupier or tenant can exit quickly without the need to find a set of keys, which again could be, you know, the difference between life and death in terms of exiting a property. So that might be one thing that you need to consider when you're looking at a property that's a HMO. Maintaining firefighting equipment. So again, in the majority of the HMOs, there will be an absolute requirement to ensure that you have a fire blanket. Also making in a lot of HMOs, there might be a requirement to have all the smoke alarms interlinked as well. And then finally, just if you have more than 4 occupiers in a HMO, then you have a legal obligation to ensure that the fire exit notices are visible in the event at night time. So a lot of them there's an obligation to have them illuminated, which again would be a requirement for where there are 5 or more than 4 occupiers, so 5 or more in a HMO. There are some obligations placed upon the occupiers. So in the legislation itself, it puts obligations upon the manager or the landlord of a particular HMO, but it also places obligations upon the tenant to ensure, obviously, they try and minimize the risks to themselves. Again, they're not allowed to frustrate access or cooperation in respect of a fire risk assessment. And equally as important, they can't obviously block fire escapes or fire exits with their own personal possessions, such as bikes, shoes, whatever it's going to be. So again, the legislation does place elements of obligations or responsibility upon the tenants and the occupiers themselves. And again, from a HMO perspective, they would also need to follow any fire risk assessment guidance that you provide. So, for example, as we go when we go through the fire risk assessment itself, there may be that you've conducted or you've produced a fire evacuation plan. So you might provide that to the tenants and occupiers, and obviously they would need to follow those instructions. Very similar to the ones that you would find in hotels. So on the back of hotel rooms or the room door, you'll find an evacuation plan, which explains to obviously the hotel guest what they need to do in the event of the fire, i.e. not take the lift, where the exit points are, etc. So in a sense, that could be very similar to what we draw up as landlords and property managers. Then the other piece of legislation which we talked about which is across the board. So this is a generic requirement to supply an alarm on each habitable floor, and also to make sure, from our perspective, that we check them regularly. So when we do the inspections, we can check to make sure that they are working. Yes, in most cases, from our position, there is a tenancy obligation for the tenant to check them periodically. But again, from our good practice perspective, it would always be good to ensure that we check them at inspections. And from my position, from a compliance perspective, really important, we have in our documentation at the very start of the tenancy, on the day the tenancy commenced, we have written evidence that we tested the alarms and that they were working. So again, that proves that we provided a working smoke alarm to the tenant. And subsequently, if it doesn't work, unless we've been informed by the tenant, then in a sense, we don't have that liability moving forward. So again, really important to evidence that in the move-in pack that you have, that that the smoke alarms were tested and were found to be working on the day that the tenancy commenced. Then you have evidence from the tenant to confirm, or you have a signature from the tenant to confirm that has been done. Again, that could potentially show or be a defence in the event of a fire occurring. So in terms of purpose-built blocks, so if I have a flat in a purpose-built block, then from a legal perspective, there's a requirement to do a fire safety or a risk assessment under the fire safety order, but that ultimately will be for the block managers or the freeholders. So again, as I was saying earlier, it's good to get information from them about what they've done in terms of complying with the fire safety order. In terms of the actual flat itself and what I've referred to on the slide as a dwelling, then there may be certain other legal requirements depending on what type of property you have. Or what type of setup in terms of occupiers that you have. So the HHSRS, which is the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, that is a proactive requirement. So that's obviously where the councils have received a complaint. So you may have some obligations there if the council have been and they want to know, or they're trying to get you to do some work because they believe there is a hazard to a particular tenant. There also may be a requirement under the HMO Management regs if the property defines or is a HMO, and also again very similar if the property is a property in a licensable area. So for example, if anyone's in Croydon in southwest London, they have selective licensing, which means every single property in that area requires a license to be able to be rented out. So therefore, there may be a license condition in Croydon that says you need to do A, B, and C. But obviously, each council is going to be slightly different in how they work. Newham, for example, is very similar. They have selective licensing. So again, every single property in that area needs a license to be let out. Same in Liverpool. And I know if anyone's in Nottingham, Nottingham have announced that their selective licensing, from my understanding, will be starting on the 1st of August this year. So again, each council may be slightly different in their requirement in respect of having a license. So again, you'll need to check your license conditions to make sure that you're complying with that particular obligation. Then the final requirement in terms of a purpose-built block is the generic requirement to have the smoke alarms tested in terms of the commencement of the tenancy. If I have dwellings with sharers in, so this is my HMO, again, I may fall under a requirement under HHSRS. I will have an absolute obligation in terms of the management of HMO. So because it's a HMO, I would have to do a risk assessment to fulfill my obligations under the management of HMO regs. And again, I may have a requirement under the license conditions, depending on what local council area I'm in, and also whether it's a mandatory licensable HMO or not. If it's a mandatory licensable HMO, which is the 5 occupiers over 3 or more floors, then the obligations in terms of fire safety are much more onerous. As I said, emergency lighting, fire doors, all those things come into play when you have a mandatory licensable HMO, because obviously the deemed risk is much more inherent for those types of properties. And again, you have an absolute obligation in terms of the smoke alarms, because that applies across the board, irrespective of what type of property that you do have. Then the final one is the dwellings with families. So there is no legal obligation to have a fire risk assessment done, but it's, again, from our perspective, it's deemed as good practice. So again, you may be required to do one under HHSRS if there is a complaint. Again, you may be required to do one if the property that you're renting out, even with a family in, falls under a license condition, such as Croydon or Liverpool or Nottingham. And again, you have a absolute legal obligation in terms of the smoke alarms in making sure that you test them on the day that the tenancy commences, and you have written evidence of such happening. In terms of the risk assessment, this is what the fire brigade say. We'll go through it very quickly. As I said, in the majority of cases, the risk assessments that you will conduct will be simple and proportionate, because the majority of the properties that you will manage or you will own will be very low risk. So the actual risk assessments themselves may be just one side of very simple A4 with your findings when you've gone round. Again, a lot of it is common sense, and you'll see that as we go through. So the 5 steps: fire hazards, people at risk, because obviously depending on the occupiers, your remedies or your action points may be slightly different. Evaluating the risk, equally as important, recording your findings. And as I said earlier, making sure that you review them depending on whether there's a change in the risk. It may be that there's a change in the appliances in the property. It may be that there's a change in the occupiers. It may be that you need now to review the risk assessment because the findings or the remedies required may have changed from when you first conducted that particular risk assessment. So the fire hazards themselves, again, very similar to that video I showed you earlier. Again, very important that you make sure in your agreements, for example, that you ban the storage of petrol in and outside of the particular properties. So making sure that the sheds or any garages, again, in your tenancy agreement, it very clearly states that they should not be storing flammable liquid. It's about you showing that you've understood the fire risk and you've tried to minimize that by having a clause in your agreement which restricts or does not allow a particular occupier or tenant to do A, B, and C. And again, storing petrol on the property itself in outside areas or outside buildings is a very simplistic way of doing that. Again, sources of ignition. I know lots of agreements will say that there's no smoking, but again, lots of them will ban the use of candles in the property, again, because that, again, will be a very high risk position in terms of fire safety. And again, sources of oxygen. in terms of making sure you might have fire doors installed. I don't know. That's probably to the extreme in terms of fire risk. But from your perspective, it may be that you advise your tenants, for example, to ensure that they close the door at night. Because when they go to sleep, actually, I think it was saying it can save or it can buy you an extra 30 minutes if you just close all the internal doors at night in the event of a fire. That could, again, be an action which is the difference between life and death, or buying you an extra 30 minutes in terms of the event of a fire. Then again, very simplistically, people at risk, obviously there may be certain categories of tenants or people visiting where you may have a slightly different position. Maybe it's people with mobility issues or the elderly. So again, depending on your types of occupiers in your property, it may be that your actions required at the end of a fire risk assessment may be slightly different depending, as I said, on the people who will be occupying the property itself. Evaluating the risk, what risks may occur. So chip pan fire, candles catching alight, what can you do? As I said earlier, very simplistically, I would ban the use of candles. If they've got a oil fire in terms of an electric, in terms of a chip pan, I would provide them with an electric fryer. Again, that would potentially reduce the risk in terms of fire. And also alarms. What types of alarms could you have in a property to, again, minimize or reduce the risk? And from my perspective, a heat detector. So a heat detector would, in most cases, detect a fire before a smoke alarm. So again, lots of councils would say as part of their fire risk assessments that a heat detector linked to the smoke alarms is a good way of reducing the risk hazard in terms of fire. And again, the use of a fire blanket or the provision of a fire blanket in the kitchen can, again, reduce the risk from fire. In terms of firefighting, as I said, maybe you want to draw up an evacuation plan. In the larger properties that you may manage, that might be a good way of showing due diligence. Obviously, in a small or in a townhouse, etc., it may not be something that's required. But again, it depends on the situation, the age of the property, the number of occupiers, who is occupying the property itself. So again, that would come down to your common sense and logic about whether you feel that you needed to draw up an evacuation plan. It might be a good idea to have an evacuation plan for all the properties that you manage, however simple they may be. But again, it's all about a simple and proportionate response to the requirement to do a fire risk assessment. And again, my understanding is that most fire brigades now recommend that you don't install fire extinguishers, because what they want is people to get out of the property rather than spend the next 5 or 10 minutes trying to fight a fire. So again, lots of the councils have changed their position in respect of installing fire extinguishers, and they now recommend that you don't install them. A fire blanket, yes, but in most cases they don't encourage you to install fire extinguishers. They want people out of the property rather than spending time trying to fight those fires. And then in terms of other fire considerations, again, the majority of fires actually start from appliances. So again, an RCD, even though there's no requirement to have an electrical condition report as of today for most properties that you manage, again, having one done would show due diligence. We've done an inspection of the main circuits, and at the time we gave it to the tenant, it was safe. So therefore, we can be confident that we tried to the best of our ability to show due diligence, a duty of care, shall I say, to the tenant and the occupiers. And it's equally as important as well, I would argue, that an portable appliance testing should be mandatory, so that you can show that anything that the landlord had provided was safe at the time it was provided. So therefore, you're showing that due diligence. Obviously, you can't do that for the tenants' appliances unless you want to do so. If the tenant sets fire to themselves in terms of their appliances, that's their issue, so to speak, from a liability perspective. But as a landlord and a letting agent, we've done as much as we can do to show that we've tried to provide the appliances and the main circuits safe. And as we know, I think my understanding that the fire at Grenfell started from a fridge. So therefore, again, it does show I think 80% of fires start from electrical appliances. So from our perspective, that's always a good place to start in terms of trying to minimize such risk. Other ones, as we talked about, banning candles, most agreements will have a no smoking clause in there. From our position as well, making sure that on periodic visits we check the alarms to make sure that they are functioning correctly, even though there's no legal obligation to do so. In terms of inspections, it just shows due diligence. Again, when we checked them, when we did the inspection, we checked, and the alarms were working. So from our perspective, that's just showing our additional compliance. Polystyrene tiles on ceilings, even though there's no legal obligation to replace them, I would always argue from a fire risk perspective, they are one of the first things that I would replace. So that's a question I do get quite a lot on the helpline. Is there a legal obligation to replace polystyrene tiles? No, there's not. But under a fire risk assessment, that would be flagging up as a red alert to me. And that's one of the first things that I would be removing and replacing. As I said, look at the exit points. In most cases, they will be easily accessible. But if they were not easily accessible, then you need to remedy that. And on the odd occasion, from our perspective, again, not the odd occasion, but it might be good practice, should I say, to create an evacuation plan for all the properties that you manage. However simple that may be, again, to show that you've gone through the thought process of trying to put your shoes in put yourself in the shoes of the occupier or tenant. What would happen in the middle of the night when the alarms go off? How will they evacuate this property? And again, it would just show your due diligence from a landlord stroke letting agent perspective. And again, really important. I always remember when I was a letting agent, window keys were probably the bane of my life in addition to utilities. Again, making sure that there are all the window keys for the relevant windows and they do operate correctly, because I know that can be quite difficult to gather. But again, it just shows due diligence. I've checked all the windows and I have all the correct keys for them. So in the event of the fire, someone can access or exit through a window if necessary, and therefore again showing due diligence. As I was saying earlier, closed doors at nights, that's a piece of evidence. I saw someone posted a picture on LinkedIn saying even the most flimsy of doors provides an element of delay in terms of a fire spreading. So from our perspective, just encourage, as part of our tenant information pack, occupiers to close doors at night. Don't accept fire doors to be propped open, which is a very regular occurrence in HMOs or mandatory licensable HMOs. People just don't like the doors because they're quite heavy, etc., but they're heavy for a reason. So therefore, again, if you're doing inspections or if you're aware that people are propping open fire doors, you make it very clear to them this is for their own safety. So therefore, you would not allow it, and it would be a breach of the tenancy if they continue to do so. And for me, this is quite a thing. I see lots of people, including my members of my family, who will use or put on electrical appliances at night. And that's ultimately where a potential risk is going to be much more prevalent in terms of a dishwasher or a washing machine or whatever it's going to be. I would say to tenants, do not operate electrical appliances at night where there is no one who is who's awake, who's able to obviously alert you in the event of a fire. So again, that would be just tenant information I would provide as part of my tenant information pack. And finally, it's just about checking the license conditions. So again, if you own a property, if you manage a property, own a property in a licensable area, such as Croydon, Newham, Nottingham, from August, Liverpool, I'm sure there are lots of other areas where license conditions apply. You'll just need to check them to make sure that you are complying. Because again, the councils don't have to tell you, it will be in the license conditions, but you just need to obviously read the license conditions to make sure you're fully aware of your legal obligations under fire safety. And that's me, thankfully, finished. It's about half an hour, so slightly over time, but hopefully that's given you a brief summary and an overview in terms of fire risk and the obligations that are placed upon a letting agent or landlord. So hopefully that's been helpful in a way for you guys that have been listening this afternoon. Hopefully that's okay, John. We can go on to the questions. Good.
You can hear me, Darrel?
You're very faint, John, and maybe it's just me, but maybe it's my old age and my hearing's gone, but you are very faint.
Can you hear me though, or not? Or shall I change? I might have to change my headphones if you can't hear me.
You sound like you're in a chamber somewhere, or under a big tunnel.
Let's have a go here.
That sounds better.
Is that better?
Yeah, that sounds a lot better. Not that, but the the previous bit did.
Is that better now?
That sounds much better.
Okay, good. So just a couple of things here. There are a couple of questions here just come on the chat, which I'll ask you in a second. And then, as I said earlier, Darrell, if you've got time, we'll just throw this open to anybody who wants to ask you a couple of questions via their mics. I don't know whether everybody saw, but there was a piece in the press this morning, fire in Edgware yesterday, where the fire department mentioned there was no fire alarms or no fire detectors present in the property. We currently, for information purposes, out of all of the housing health and safety rating reports, the heads up reports that we issue, we're currently running at 27% of no or non-working smoke detectors in properties at the moment. I mean, that's a huge number. And we run at around about 12 to maybe 13 to 15% of every inventory we complete has a housing health and safety report issued, of which 27% of them are smoke and CO related, mostly smoke related. So it's a huge number. And I know that some of the agents, clients that I've spoken to about this are absolutely shocked at how many properties are rented out. This is through agents, by the way, that do not have proper working smoke or CO detectors working. So this is a huge issue. And I know also, having spoken to a couple of agents who have had fires, recently they discovered afterwards that there was no smoke detector working. It might have been one present, but there wasn't one working. And in both cases, I'm told the insurance companies are declining any insurance cover. So pretty serious thing, by the way. So a couple of questions here, Darrell. Let's have a quick look at this one here. So if I can find it here for the minute. Yes. How far do you think our obligations go if we are only providing a tenant find service?
I personally, I don't think it goes as far as the management side. If you're advertising a property for let from a letting agent perspective, I would argue across the board that the property that you are advertising for let, irrespective of it's tenant find, let only, or fully managed, needs to be risk assessed. So I would argue that obligation applies equally. I don't think you can remove liability by saying, actually, we're only finding a tenant. Ultimately, that tenant is coming to you as a professional agent to make sure that A, B, and C has been done. So I would argue it being a tenant find doesn't remove or diminish the liability whatsoever.
Very interesting. Quick question, which I did answer actually. However, I will ask you again. Is hang on, where's the question here? With regard to smoke detectors, I think this was, does it need to specify anything in, this is on the fire risk assessment. Does it need to specify anything in written evidence when testing smoke alarms? I know on our fire risk assessment, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, we do mention this. So over to you, Darrell. Does that have to be written? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the gold-plated standard is getting the tenant to sign something to say they've seen you test it. That is the gold-plated standard. I fully appreciate it's going to be very difficult to get a tenant to do that, but again, if you move your tenants in, which I know lots of agents and landlords still do, then that should be quite simple in terms of its execution. I think I would be concerned about the agents who, and I've worked for one where they just basically give a set of keys to the tenants in the office. So therefore, it was down to the tenant to move themselves in. And that's a bit harder to prove in terms of what was tested and when did you test it. So the gold-plated standard for me is getting the tenant to sign something to say X, Y, and Z was done. There is so much information in addition to a fire risk assessment that we need to give to tenants these days, or in addition to smoke alarm testing. There is so much information that we need to give them. I fully appreciate they are going to be somewhat overloaded with stuff that we have to provide to them. But again, for me, that's the gold-plated standard.
What I'll do, Darrell, and this is for everybody on the webinar, as you probably know, those of you who are watching this, there is a recording being made of this. I will send out a sample fire risk assessment, whether it's a made-up one or a real one, I don't know, but we'll send out a sample one to everybody that's on this webinar who has registered for this webinar, so that they can, or you can see the questions we are asking and the answers we give in relationship to that assessment. We cover everything that Darrell's done on this presentation here. And even though, and Darrell, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, even though you can, do your own fire risk assessment, a landlord can do their own, as you said earlier on, Darrell. The thing is, of the templates I've seen that are downloadable from different websites, they're a single page, pretty flimsy in terms of information. We go the extra mile. I think it's about 16 pages worth of information, of which some information we do require from the agent or landlord in relationship to the tenancy agreement. But it's a pretty lengthy assessment. And I would like to think with the assessments we do, one is well and truly covered as far as an assessment is concerned.
I totally agree, Jonathan. I know we spent a couple of months together last year, wasn't it, putting the assessment together. So we've gone through, I would believe, almost every permutation that we could think of in terms of fire risk. And as I said, as you rightly said, there are a couple of fire risk assessments out there which are 1 page long, which, again, I'm not saying that won't cover you in the event of a fire, but I think from a VeriSmart perspective, we've worked quite diligently on producing a fire risk assessment, which is very simple to complete from a clerk's perspective, but again, from a protection perspective, in terms of the landlord and the letting agent, I believe provides the highest standard possible from our perspective in terms of conducting a fire risk assessment.
Great, and I think that one of the context of some of what we've been doing in terms of putting this all together is with an assumption, and it is only an assumption at the moment, that thanks to, well, not thanks, that's the wrong word to use, by the way, with what's happened in London, as we're seeing, and where we're seeing elsewhere with regard to fires, I would have thought that legislation might get tightened on this. So we're just kind of getting ready just in case. But even if it doesn't, I think best practice, and also from our point of view, there's kind of a moral issue for us. That is to say, if we see things that we believe could put a tenant's health and safety in jeopardy, then we'd like to report that, which most of us do, I think, anyway. So I don't know whether anybody's got any questions they want to ask directly to Darrell. I'll give you a few seconds if you like to unmute yourself and pose a question or two. Oh, you can use chat, of course. So Darrell's just put, while any of you are thinking of that, he's just put his email there. Darrell, for those of you who don't know, is accessible through our online booking system through a button called the Lettings Helpline. So Darrell's available through our system for any questions that people might want to ask over the next upcoming period of time, say 6 months and beyond. If they have any queries with regard to not just what we're talking about today, but anything to do with lettings legislation and so on. And of course, with what's going on with the possible tenant fee ban, clearly GDPR and so on, we aim to run a few seminars on each particular subject. And on that subject, we have a webinar similar to today's that we've currently booked for anybody that registers. And I'm going to just take it that everybody on this particular seminar that's registered, we will include, which is on the subject of Legionella on the 6th of March. We have a couple of other industry experts that have expressed interest in participating in these webinars. Susie Hirschman, Head of Compliance at My Deposits, is talking about presenting in April, and we've got a few others. So we will keep people informed of what webinars are coming up. So let me see, somebody's just asked the question. There we are, Carol. Yes, would like more seminars. Yes, so I've just answered that, by the way. So yeah, I don't know how many we'll run. We'll just keep running them. And I think we're going to have enough material over the next, certainly this year, to make these these webinars worthwhile. So any other questions for anybody? And as you saw there, Darrell's email's there if you want to email him direct. Yeah,
I just wanted to say, Jonathan, it just obviously my email's there, and I provide, as you rightly said, I provide the helpline service to VeriSmart license or clients, I'm providing that for 6 months free from when they first, or from when you first contact me. So that's available. Also, in addition to that, if you want to be added to my mailing list, which the slide shows, then I will send you information about legal updates, court decisions, etc., etc. Also, in addition to that, I send out information about courses I run as well, just to make you aware of that. You do have the ability to opt out of those, but again, it's all about just keeping you informed of the continued compliance and legislative changes that we are facing as a letting industry or private rented industry, which is, or seems to be, never ending, but not a bad thing for the sake of making sure that we keep tenants and our properties safe.
Great. Okay. Doesn't look like there's any more questions, Darrell. Thank you very much for this. And we'll see you on the 6th of March for the Legionella one.
Cheers, Jonathan. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you for those thanking us. Bye-bye now.